think we are all aware that the challenges we are facing today, in particular with respect to the protection of those forcibly displaced, are genuinely enormous. One has only to look at the statistics. A staggering 68.5 million people are currently displaced, both inside their own countries and beyond. And it is important that we too often forget about the IDPs. We should not. Today's internally displaced are often tomorrow's refugees. When Dr. Türk last spoke at IPI, he described forced displacement as the most manifest expression of conflict. 4 years on, that continues to be the case. Indeed, this record number of displacement is largely thanks to trends in contemporary conflict, as violence against civilians has increased. And we are witnessing gross violations of international humanitarian law and human rights in multiple contexts. One way in which the international community is attempting to address the challenge of displacement has been through the development of the Global Compact on Refugees, under the leadership of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in consultation with member states and other stakeholders. The Global Compact aims to ease the pressure on host countries, enhance the self-reliance of refugees, expand access to third country solutions, and support the conditions in countries of origin for a safe and dignified return. The High Commissioner recently proposed a final text of the Global Compact in his annual report, and it is expected to come before the General Assembly before the end of the year. Thus, we are quite fortunate to have Dr. Türk here to brief us on current protection challenges as well as developments around the Global Compact on refugees. Volker will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we should have quite ample time for discussion. With that, Volker, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay, good. No, thank you very much, Adam, and to the IPI for giving me a chance again to interact with all of you and to give you a bit of an update on where we are on the global displacement scale of things, but also to, in a way, report a bit on what I think was quite an amazing process that we have been engaged in over the last 18 months, which is this Global Compact on Refugees that Adam mentioned. And I think it is important first to look at the facts and the figures. I mean, we have, as you said, over 68.5 million people displaced as a result of conflict, human rights violations, as a result of persecution. So these are people who flee their homes, either internally or externally, because of a particular situation in their country of origin. And it is important to deconstruct that number because 68.5 million is, of course, a huge population. 40 million out of those are internally displaced. They have not crossed the border. And I think it's important because sometimes, especially in the public debate, we often hear about these masses of people wanting to come to the Western world, but that's absolutely not the case. The vast majority of people are internally displaced. They are not able to leave their country. Very often, as you know, if you just look at the Syria situation, for example, people are not even able sometimes to leave their enclaves, and we had a lot of issues around hard-to-reach areas and so forth. So I think it's important to bear this in mind. Apart from, you have the 40 million, then you have about 25 million people that are refugees, people who have crossed an international border. About 20 million out of these 25 million fall under the mandate of UNHCR, 5 million mandate of the UN Refugee and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. And then you have, and this is not in the context of displacement, but I would like to mention as well, UNHCR in particular also has a responsibility for stateless people, about 10 million estimated, people who have no nationality. And I mean, the most recent example, as you know, of where this has become particularly an issue is, of course, the context of Myanmar with the influx of 800,000 Rohingya refugees from Myanmar into Bangladesh. And one of the root causes of that phenomenon is, of course, related to the fact that they don't have a nationality. And I think it's important to bear this in mind. And if one looks at just the figure of migration, I mean, I think the figure that is normally used is about 250 million migrants compared to 25 million refugees and 20 million under UNHCR's mandate out of these 25. It actually shows that sometimes the political discourse around refugee issues is not necessarily in proportion to the actual realities on the ground. Because one should also bear in mind that the 20 million refugees are mostly hosted in the global south and in middle-income countries closest to conflict areas. And I think, again, that's very, very important to bear in mind. So you have over 90% of the 20 million that are actually not in the industrialized world. They are not in the West. They are in the global south. They are closest to areas of origin. And I think you all, of course, are fully aware. If Philippe Lazzarini was here, he told you about Lebanon, where you have over 1 million Syrian refugees with a population of 4 million. So you can imagine what this actually means for a country, in addition to the Palestinian refugees that Lebanon has hosted for a very long time. And we see this across the world. We have some countries that are particularly affected by refugee movements that really, if you like, need to ensure that everything is provided for them and in huge numbers. And sometimes this happens in the most remote, in the most difficult to reach areas of a country, because if you just look at the South Sudanese flight into Ethiopia or Uganda, for example, it's in areas that are very difficult to go to. And that's where the refugee world really plays out. And I think it's important to bear in mind the realities that exist on the ground. If you listen to what refugees are telling us, I think it's very important to actually see and hear them and listen to what their stories are. And these are familiar stories of what happens in conflict. All the things that I think, especially here at the UN, when it comes to conflict and violence and human rights violations, refugees are the embodiment that something has gone awry in a country, that something has gone terribly wrong, that there are issues why people leave. I mean, they don't leave just for the sake of leaving, they leave for a very good reason. And it is related to essentially conflict, violence, human rights violations. And I think it is important, again, to bear that in mind and to listen to the stories that refugees bring to us. But I also know that within these horror stories that we sometimes hear, there are also stories of incredible resilience. Because sometimes, again, refugees are presented only as victims. They are not victims. They are people just like us. It can happen to any of us. And sometimes, you know, in the history of humanity, one forgets that you can end up in a situation where, indeed, you may have to leave your country for political reasons, because of who you are, your identity, because you belong to a minority group, because you're a woman, or because you are belonging to the LGBTI community, because you have a disability. And I think it's important to bear in mind that, yes, there's a certain predicament that refugees are in, but at the same time, what we have also seen is incredible resilience and courage and wanting to contribute, wanting to change your lives. And I think it is important not to forget that dimension when we especially hear about some of the discussions about the victimization of refugees. They are not victims. They're also people like us who want to get on with their lives. What we have seen since the end of the Second World War is the establishment of a very solid legal framework that protects refugees. And that was clearly out of the experience of the Second World War, where you had a lot of population movements in Europe and elsewhere as a result of persecution, as a result of conflict, of violence, of various other matters. And we did not have at that stage a comprehensive framework that would cover who is a refugee and what standard of treatment is due to them. And that's what happened in the immediate post-war period, where very quickly the international community came together and drafted a convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, because sometimes in the discourse today I hear this is a Cold War instrument, it's outdated, it doesn't fit anymore to current purposes. No, I have to say that's humbug, because actually it does precisely respond to the current realities of people on the move who flee conflict, violence, and persecution. And let's bear in mind what the framers or the drafters of the convention had just experienced coming out of the Second World War. And it was very much in their mind what had happened. So it was precisely about those issues. I think it's also important that as any legal instrument, the 51 Convention, the 1967 Protocol, the various regional instruments that were established, that it was always felt that international law, international refugee law, is adaptable to evolving circumstances, as international law generally is. So, of course, when we identified cases, there's a very famous decision here in the US, the Kasinga decision in '94, a woman fleeing female genital mutilation because she did not want her children to be subjected to the cultural practices at the time. And she got refugee status. It was really a remarkable decision. So it shows that gender-related persecution was analyzed and was brought within the frame of the 1951 Convention, as cases of sexual orientation and gender identity, as it was absolutely clear that people who flee conflict and violence are covered by the Convention and by the 1967 Protocol. So it shows the adaptability of the legal framework to respond to evolving circumstances. What also happened, and that's remarkable from an international relations perspective, in the wake of the Second World War, an institution was created, and that's quite something. UNHCR, 1950, 1951. I mean, we were created in 51 as well, as an entity that represents people. So we were asked by the General Assembly in the statute to intercede with states on behalf of people, because refugees were cut off from their country of origin. You know, they don't have diplomatic or consular protection that we would normally enjoy as a citizen, because you have a rupture with your country of origin, so you depend on something else, and you need someone to help you intercede on behalf of you with states. That was remarkable, that was, you know, at a discussion when it was all about national sovereignty issues and interference, it was always considered that this institution can represent people with states before courts. We are actually an organization that offers to the highest courts in countries around the world our legal expertise. And we have done, I think, some 250 amicus curiae briefs with courts all around the world, often the highest courts, but also International Court of Human Rights, for instance, in Strasbourg, the Luxembourg Court, in the context of the Inter-American human rights system. So we actually present our legal opinion. And we were asked, and that's, I quote, to supervise the application of the 1951 Convention. And states have an obligation to cooperate with us in this. That's Article 35 of the 51 Convention. So you can imagine that's quite a robust institution that has the moral duty and the legal obligation to act on behalf of refugees. And I think that's, I mean, if one looks at multilateralism and institution building, and it shows that you need sometimes a motor, you need a vehicle that goes above interests of purely a national nature, that is able to actually represent the individual in relation to an affair that is fundamentally humanitarian and non-political. And I think it's also important that our work was always, of course, takes place within a political framework, but as such, asylum, granting asylum, refugee protection is non-political and humanitarian. So, and this is a bit the background of the institutional framework, and what a little bit also how the Global Compact on refugees is quite a remarkable piece, because of course we have this solid legal framework. We have a lot of operational experience. We have a lot of experience because of us being out there with countries, with NGOs, with other partners, trying to assist and protect refugees all around the world. There's one thing that the international community has not been able to put in place, and that's what I mentioned earlier, this concept of responsibility sharing, because of course the responsibilities are really defined by geographical proximity. I mean, if you're a country, a neighboring country to a country in conflict, you often, yes, you will have to deal with refugee flows, as we see in Africa, as we see in the Middle East, as we see in different parts of Asia, as also now in the context of Latin America. Of course, those countries that are closest will have to receive most refugees. What the international community has not been able to do in a comprehensive way is to actually consolidate responsibility sharing. So what is it that the international community is going to do in order to help a state that is particularly affected because of a large-scale influx, or because sometimes conflicts don't end and you actually need to find ways and means to engage with this country, help the host community to come to concrete support that the country needs. And the Global Compact on Refugees, which is actually quite a remarkable coming together of international cooperation at a time when, quite frankly, it has been very difficult. We have also seen that it's not that easy sometimes to reach multilateral agreements these days. I think the fact that it was possible to rally around a humanitarian, non-political cause where it is about people fundamentally and about host communities made it possible to craft this Global Compact on Refugees and develop predictability when it comes to responsibility sharing. And that's really what the Global Compact is about. So it's not about, like the Global Compact on Migration, that covers for the first time each and every aspect, or many aspects of migration. The Global Compact on Refugees is honing in very concretely on one issue, one gap that we have lived through the last 70 years, which is more predictability when it comes to responsibility sharing for those countries that are particularly affected. And I think that's what the beauty of this document is, that we hope that in the next couple of weeks before the end of the year, that the General Assembly will validate. It has been a long journey. We have had 18 months of engagement. We have done the rollout of a comprehensive refugee response framework in 15 countries, in 2 regions, to learn also how it can be operationally applied and to learn lessons from this. And the product is what was presented by the High Commissioner in August to the General Assembly, is this text, which is essentially a mechanism of ensuring that states that are confronted with a large-scale influx of refugees, that they are able to count on the support from the international community on a wide range of areas: infrastructure, access to education, access to health, access to livelihood issues, but also on the solution side. And I have to say, having worked in this area for almost 30 years, this was quite, for us, a huge moment of making sure that finally the international community wakes up, comes together, and we had fantastic engagement of all member states, of the private sector, of the World Bank, of course, of the civil society, of in particular our non-governmental partners, in order to bring this together. And we did it through an iterative process, an organic process, developing this compact along the way through both informal as well as formal consultations over the last 18 months or so. So what does this Global Compact do? First of all, it makes sure that the refugee issue is not becoming again an issue that doesn't attract the necessary attention that it deserves and it requires. Because quite frankly, a couple of years ago, when you talked about refugee issues, they were not part of a political priority in terms of predictability, in terms of funding and so forth. So that's what it does. It also makes sure that it is a multi-stakeholder partnership approach. It's clear that it's not one institution, UNHCR, that can do the be-all, it can be the be-all and the end-all of everything to do with refugee matters. No, it is clear we always have had a very strong tradition, of course with member states, but also with non-governmental partners, but also increasingly with the international financial institutions. We have had incredible sea change in the way that the World Bank, for example, has engaged. And we have even through this process seen how the World Bank Group, for instance, has looked at its financial instruments so that they can react quickly when it comes to, for example, an emergency like in Bangladesh. I mean, normally you would see the development banks take a bit more time, but in this case, within a couple of months after the emergency, the World Bank was able to provide 400 million to the Bangladesh government in support of Bangladesh for the host communities that are affected in order to give them help on education and health infrastructure and so forth. And that's very important because, of course, countries that are affected by an influx of this kind, they require that help. We have also seen much more engagement on the part of the private sector. I mean, interesting ideas of investment. We just developed together with IOM and UNCTAD in Geneva a market investment guidance, where particularly those areas that are affected by refugee influx, where you can actually find ways and means that you boost the economy, you boost development for that part, and you turn what otherwise is a crisis into a huge opportunity. And that's what the Global Compact does. It actually tries to address very concretely some of the conundrums that we have faced over and over and over again in order to be able to deal with it in a much better way. The Global Compact has a part on solutions which looks at the traditional ones, which is of course voluntary repatriation, but also local integration when governments decide that this is important and that's the only way to resolve a refugee situation. But it's also about resettlement, complementary pathways, I mean other ways of a third country solution, if you like, and with a strong emphasis on making sure that we broaden the partnerships that we have currently, that we get more actors involved in all of this. And I think another novelty that I personally have enjoyed very much in this process, that we actually have refugees participate in these consultations. We had refugees be part of panels, they could speak from the plenary, they could participate, and in the so-called Global Refugee Forum that we will have next year, in the text we have actually in the text codified that we will ensure refugee participation at a ministerial meeting that, if you like, puts forward and operationalizes or puts this into concrete action what the Global Compact is supposed to deliver. Despite the fact that it's global, it is very much happening at the local level, at the country level, with partners, with the population that is directly affected, both refugees as well as host communities. So I think what the Global Compact has done is in a way modernized a very concrete tool and responding to a gap that we have faced over the last decades, building on a long-standing experience and developing something that could be a real sea change in the way that the international community engages in the future with refugee movement. So despite, I know, a lot of doom and gloom that we have, we should also be able to celebrate what I think is an incredible process and an incredible product that can only help people, real lives, and will touch lives of people out there in very concrete ways. And we have seen the fruit of that engagement already. So, yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's really, really comprehensive and tremendously organized statement on the global context, a little bit of a history lesson there, which I quite enjoyed, and then a briefing on the Global Compact on refugees, and interesting this point about, in contrast to the Global Compact on migration, that it's really honing in on this very specific element That's very helpful. And I really do take your point about the importance of listening to refugees and incorporating it directly into the process. It's really laudable, and I think many parts of the UN system could learn from that. I wanted to ask you, before we open the floor, a bit more about your specific role as Assistant High Commissioners for Protection. We were talking a little bit about this before coming on stage. It's really quite unique in the UN system, this dedicated role for protection. And I just came back from 3 days at Wilton Park in a seminar on atrocity prevention. And the conversation, I think there was a general agreement that while we need to do much more work on upstream prevention issues, we're living at a time where there really is a regrettable systematic pushback on issues related to human rights and international humanitarian law that elevate the urgency for protection issues. And I'm wondering, in that context, is your portfolio getting more difficult? Do you find support for your role sufficient? Do you have what you need, the tools that you need? And how do you see your specific role in the current context shifting or not?
Well, I think, when you deal with protection issues, when it comes to refugees, internally displaced and stateless people, I think it's clear that this is a huge task. Of course, one should never personalize it. It is the task of an organization. It's the task of member states, and we are an important vehicle in all of this. What helps us, and that's the difficulty, I think, when it comes to migration issues, because in the refugee arena you have a international treaty-based system in place. It means we're talking here about international legal obligations. And so it does help us to, if you like, advance some of the discussions. And as I was mentioning, the fact that we as a UN organization, since the mid-80s, have always offered our legal advice to courts is quite remarkable. Because I don't know whether other organizations would do this, but it actually has. And we are expected from the Supreme Court of Canada or the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom or the High Court in Kenya, when they ask us, they expect us to deliver to them our legal opinion. And I think that's important because it actually influences state practice enormously. And it's a leverage that we have that perhaps is really built on the treaty-based system. Of course, the policy side is complicated because what sometimes gets forgotten, I won't hide that from you, is when we see restrictive tendency in one country, and we see them in different countries around the world, it often has a snowball effect on others. And when I remember we had a very difficult discussion in Europe in 2015, we had similar difficult discussions with some of our traditional partners on the African continent. Some were saying, Europe is putting forward. Europe is. Can you? Okay. Okay, I hope. Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, sorry. So the issue has been, is this, when you see restrictive tendencies in one country, it unfortunately affects other parts of the world as well. Because of course it gets noticed. If one country, for example, puts people into processing centers, offshore processing centers elsewhere, we have a discussion with some states that then wonder, why is this happening and what are you saying about this, and why are we, as Kenya or Pakistan or Iran, dealing with so many refugees and we have millions and this other country only has a couple of thousand, and how do you square that circle? So that's obviously very difficult. I think we have learned over decades to do it through direct operational engagement, to be out there, to engage with refugees, with governments, with NGOs, and to be concrete in the help that we provide. That has been actually the only way to get the space that we need so that you keep asylum and you keep the door open for refugees. Which is why the Global Compact is so important. The other area is, of course, the policy area. I mean, we try to influence as much as possible policies, because some of the policies in Europe, just to give you an example, where we had very difficult discussions in the context of the Central Mediterranean issues, is also to find ways and means to engage with states of how they could deal with an asylum system in a different way that is more responsive to the needs that they have. Yes, I think I don't think protection has ever been easy as a task, because I remember when I went to one country and I handed over my letter of accreditation, the foreign minister told me, yes, you have a difficult task because you are actually protecting the people that we consider undesirable on our territory. I mean, it was a sort of friendly conversation, but that's the dilemma that we are constantly facing. And I think it shows it, but we are sort of, I think we are very much driven by the fact that we know the people, we know the stories, we know what they tell us, and it engages you differently also with governments. When you actually hear and you have the person in front of you that tells you what happened to them when they fled Syria or Myanmar or Afghanistan or South Sudan, and it gives you a different authenticity, I think, in the way you engage. And we have also seen, and let's not just, we have also seen incredible positive developments. I mean, we have seen countries that opened up and did not continue with detention practices. We have seen communities that open up. I mean, even in some of the countries that currently go through a very difficult phase, you have incredible signs of generosity, of welcoming, you have also that side. Unfortunately, it doesn't attract enough attention. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Okay, we'll open up the floor right away. Walter, yes, here, Walter Dorn, and then we'll come up here. Mm-hmm. Please,
Walter Dorn from the Royal Military College of Canada. I'm intrigued about your scope of the term definition. For those of us who are involved in peacekeeping, we think of protection as being against physical threats, like in Security Council resolutions, protection of civilian is against imminent threat of physical attack. So do you deal with protection in a much more broad sense, in the human security sense of freedom from fear and freedom from want? Or is your protection mandate very much like it is in peacekeeping?
We'll take a few as I come back. And then we have right here in the center, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Miriam Bella. I work for the Stabilization Support Unit in MONUSCO in DRC. And I wanted to come back to the IDP question, because I'm not sure if I really understood what the mandate of UNHCR is for IDPs. And then also, especially if we deal with situations in DRC like 20 years of IDP camps and people that have been there for a very long time. For stabilization work, UNHCR has been a key partner for finding durable solution for IDP. So maybe also if there's a shift in mandate also towards more kind of away from pure humanitarian tasks to more kind of durable solution finding tasks.
Great. If you could just pass it right there to your...
Thank you. Peter Mulrain from UNRWA. First, congratulations on the Global Compact, but you made reference to the CRRF during your remarks, which was interesting because it was in parallel with this process, but gave you an opportunity through pilot countries to see the operationalization of the concepts in the compact. So I'd be interested in hearing first, how, as you've started implementing with the pilot countries, how has the experience been in the attitudes of the countries and the ability to sort of be more accepting of the refugees? And secondly, sort of on a more theoretical plane, is the implementation of this really demonstrating that local integration is the, if not preferred solution, is the most practical solution in protracted situations?
Great, those are three really concise, concrete questions. Very good. I think we'll come back to you now, and then we'll have time for another round. Yeah.
So the notion of protection for UNHCR. Actually, the correct term is what it says in the statute is that UNHCR has a duty to provide international protection. And that's a term of art, if you like. It's not protection in the sense of physical protection, as of course the peacekeeping operations have to undertake. And international protection is then defined in para 8 of the statute. It's quite interesting to read it because it was written in 1950 and negotiated in 1950, and to read it in the context of today, because it's actually an interesting lesson of what protection means for a particular category of people that are in a particular predicament. And it's about promotion, it's about accessions to conventions, it's about making sure that someone is held accountable and that we point out the legal obligations that states have. And it's also about making sure that we concretely help countries and communities that are affected. So it's different from the concept of protection of civilians that you have, especially in peacekeeping operations. But it is not dissimilar, because at the end of the day, if you manage to get a refugee secured and the person has access to territory and has access to asylum, you save this person's lives. So it's a different form of protection. I mean, the term as such comes from the absence of diplomatic and consular protection that refugees have. And that's how, if you like, from an international legal perspective, that's how it was developed. Because normally, as a citizen, if you don't have a problem with your country, or if the country is able to do what it normally is supposed to do, it provides consular and diplomatic protection. Well, a Syrian refugee is not able to get that from his or her country of origin. So you need somehow an entity that replaces that type of access to the legal sphere, to intercession, to make sure that representations can be made on behalf of individuals for it. So it's a little bit more technical in that sense. But it has some similarities, and I think as you have pointed out, it plays out much more concretely in the context of our work with internally displaced or in complex humanitarian emergencies. And I think that notion of protection from the refugee arena was brought also in the context of countries of origin. And it is somewhat different. It is closer, I think, to what the protection notion is in international humanitarian law, especially, of course, ICRC is the custodian of international humanitarian law. When it comes to UNHCR itself, within the UN system, as you know, we were asked within the interagency context to coordinate the protection side, and we're leading, for example, the Global Protection Cluster, which is an interagency working together on protection issues that arise in complex humanitarian emergencies. It will require a strong interface with the peacekeeping. That's absolutely clear, and in fact, in many situations around the world, that interface is absolutely crucial. I remember Central African Republic. What the protection colleagues with the humanitarian organizations could do is map very quickly what are the hotspots, what are the potential flashpoints, and how can we ensure that we also then work with, for instance, the military, so that safety and security can be provided. So there is this interface that you have between what humanitarian agencies can do, and that has to be respected, of course, but also with peacekeeping or peace operations more generally, because they need to work together on this. And protection sometimes is the glue that brings them together on this. IDPs more concretely, our first engagement with internally displaced goes back to 1972, the first time that the General Assembly, it was actually Sudan, IDP situation. And ever since, because of the similarity of people being displaced for the very similar reasons, whenever it was possible, UNHCR became involved. I mean, I remember we were the lead agency when I was in the Balkans, in Bosnia and in Kosovo, and actually in the whole of the Balkans. We were the lead agency on IDPs. This has, because of the magnitude, of course, much better that there is a strong interagency approach operationally by everyone. where you have clear leads identified in very specific areas, which is, of course, protection for us. But I think the most important thing is that, and you have seen a lot of more emphasis on the particular plight of internally displaced people, that the IDP guiding principles, and by the way, we have the 20th anniversary of the IDP guiding principles this year, that is not just a text, but gets implemented. And we hope to use this, including, by the way, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including on the solution side, because I think it is true when it comes to solutions, very often we don't necessarily see the same way of engaging, because after all, these are citizens in your country. If people decide at the end of the day, because it's so difficult to live where they currently are, to stay where they have fled to, the state has to provide the opportunity for them to do that, because they cannot go back. In DRC, we have many places where people cannot go back. Sometimes they, of course, they can go back. In some instances, in other places, they cannot. And then it is an obligation to make sure that people are able to get on with their lives where they are. And the solutions dimension is, there was an interesting Brookings study that was done where I think the transition between humanitarian work and solutions work, and especially the development work that it requires, needed a lot more attention. And I think we have seen over the years, I mean, OCHA also did some very good work on making sure that the solutions angle is brought in much more, because otherwise it permeates even the notion of grievances sometimes. And displacement, if you pass that on from one generation to the next, it harbors grievances that are often very deep, and they are not necessarily in the interest of peace. So it is important that people find ways and means to get on with their lives. So the solutions to internal displacement situation is absolutely crucial. Peter, on the comprehensive refugee response framework, you see, despite the fact that we don't yet have the global compact fully sealed, in more colloquial terms, it is interesting that the rollout of the comprehensive refugee response framework in 15 countries has really, we have seen incredible engagement both in these countries in terms of, for example, Ethiopia opening up their employment market, opening up labor possibilities, opening up, actually pursuing an out-of-camp policy, because they used to have much stronger camp, people put into camps. No, they've actually decided on an out-of-camp policy. But at the same time, they also expect to have more support. We have seen in Djibouti opening up their educational facilities to refugee children. In Uganda, fantastic, Uganda has basically included refugees in their national development programs. Remarkable, huh? That you have a country that says, okay, refugees are there, they're here to stay for some time to come. Why not take the advantage of making sure that our national development program is boosted to such an extent that it can also cover refugees? And I think that's quite remarkable. So we have seen a lot of modernizing of the approaches by making sure that the needs of host communities and of refugees are analyzed in the context, for example, of the Syria situation, with very good studies done by the World Bank on the socio-economic impact that we have seen in Jordan and in Lebanon as a result of the refugee influx, and then defining what it is that countries would then need as a result. We did an internal quick analysis of what we think has come in terms of additional development funds, not to UNHCR, it's not about UNHCR, it's not about fundraising for UNHCR, but in terms of what governments got ever since, for the last 2 years, it's about 6 billion in addition development cooperation funds that have come in for countries that are particularly affected. And that shows in and of itself that the process of the rollout of the so-called CRF, the fact that we have had these discussions around crafting the global compact, has had an incredible impact, a concrete impact for countries, for people. And yes, on local integration, this is always a very, as you remember, is always a very vexed discussion within the intergovernmental framework, because on the one hand, it's clear that refugee situations become protracted, they last much longer. Solutions, return are often not in sight. I mean, we're just going through this in the context of the Rohingya situation in Bangladesh. I mean, we have all these MOUs, but we still haven't seen any returns for good reasons. So the question, how do you deal with the interim period? And what the Global Compact does, it at least makes sure that we see the access to education, the access to skills training, the access to livelihood as an investment for the future, both of refugees and for the future of their countries once they're able to go back, but also as an investment in the host community, so that it actually almost leads to a revitalization of certain parts of the country that are particularly affected. And by the way, that goes for the Western world as well. I mean, I have seen a lot of communities that, quite frankly, especially in rural areas in Europe, but also elsewhere, where you actually sometimes wonder, you don't see a very strong dynamic community anymore. But once you have refugees come in, there are communities in Europe that were really deeply grateful, that maybe with an initial fear, but once they were exposed to it, they saw that, yes, it managed to make sure that the schools remain open, that healthcare is provided to older people, it was a revitalization of rural areas. I mean, we don't hear these stories enough, but that's also a reality. We only hear the negativity, but we don't hear all these positive engagement examples, even of people that at the beginning were very skeptical.
Great, thank you. We have another round here, Fabian, and then Yael, and then in the back. Yeah. Oh, okay. Fabian, yeah. Oh, no?
Thank you. MSF is very friendly. Stephanie with the Women's Refugee Commission. At the Women, Peace and Security debate, I feel it was last week, even though it feels it's been a long week for everyone, she stressed that global military spending has reached $1.74 trillion US, a 57% increase since 2000. And in times of resources short, especially of humanitarian aid, do you feel there has been a deeper understanding with governments that investing in human rights and protection, human security, increases security overall? Thank you.
Thank you. Fabien Dubé with MSF. Welcome back to New York. I know it's a bit sensitive, but I wanted to ask you about Libya. I mean, as you know well, this is one of the very serious protection crises we are dealing with right now. And I'm referring in particular to the thousands of people who are, as you know, trapped in the so-called detention centers. And I just wanted to ask you if you could a little bit share with us where you are in terms of, there's a lot of ongoing initiatives, but if you could share with us a little bit where UNHCR stands. I mean, there are various options and what the challenges are. Thank you.
And here you can get the Yael. Yeah.
Thanks. I want to add the mental health and trauma point of view. I know that UNHCR has developed immensely through the years toward that dimension of understanding, and in your comments, in fact, you showed the real insight that is the most recent findings we have in the field of trauma, is that when you keep traumatized people identifying themselves as victims, you put their children at risk. That is, even children who are not born yet. So you said that. I was totally delighted. But I wonder, we also have measures for that, actually. So that could be very helpful in terms of really showing evidence of success. And that leads me to just again and again and again point out the long-term commitment that must be there for the international community. because you raised a lot of issues in terms of coordination with development, with OCHA, et cetera, et cetera. I don't even want to go to the institutional silo level. But when do you leave? When do you feel you have done your job, that is UNHCR, literally in terms of time? When do you feel you've done your job and now the future is open for these refugees who are no longer then refugees, perhaps?
We'll take one more before we go in the back, Matthew.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I wanted to ask you about, I know that you went on a mission to Tanzania to check out the situation of Burundian refugees. And recently the government's been making some pretty belligerent statements about its opponents. And I'm just wondering, does UNHCR think these are actually free and fair, voluntary returns to Burundi? Is there a push on to get people sent back? And I also want to ask you about Cameroonians in Nigeria and also inside the country. There were 47 people sent back from Nigeria, refoulement, just straight illegal. And many people felt that the UN didn't say enough. The Deputy Secretary General was there when it happened and didn't say anything. There was actually a UNHCRC staff member who's called online for harsher repression against Anglophone Cameroonian, quote, separatists. I don't know if this is under your radar, but do you think that the UN has dealt effectively and sufficiently with the situation in Anglophone Cameroon? Thanks a lot.
Do you want to keep going? Okay,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
will,
yeah.
so
I think
that, because we, okay, so we'll hear, yeah?
Hi, I'm Alex Zetas with the Refugee Solidarity Network. You mentioned issues of policy and when countries make certain moves that then have these ripple effects throughout the rest of the world. And many of these various conventions and things like this Global Compact, these are not binding things. These are sort of voluntary and norms evolutionary. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to this notion of customary international law and sort of the things that countries are obligated towards, even if they don't, sort of if they're not participating in the Global Compact and if they haven't signed on to the various conventions. What are those protections, and do we see the Global Compact and these various incredible developments as sort of moving towards a more positive obligations, even on countries that are not choosing to engage in these processes? Thank you.
Great, and here, Joanne, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, IPA also. My name is Joanna Meyer. My question is about the United States, if there's a long-term game plan to address the United States, because I'm an American citizen from California, really, but we've backed out of every kind of compact that would help improve the refugee situation in the world. And from what I can tell, I don't think the current administration is going to be opening up doors or taking greater responsibility while we continue to exacerbate the other issues. So any thoughts on that? And I want to thank the gentleman from Inner City Press for bringing up Cameroon. Thank you.
Seem to be entering into the tough political questions portion of the program.
Yes.
I think that's a lot on the table. You want to?
Yeah. So, I think Stephanie, you see, the pool of humanitarian funding has, of course, increased over the last couple of years. I mean, we have clearly seen this. I mean, you had a much lower base even 5 years ago, and I think there was recognition by our traditional donor countries that indeed you need to increase this, and they did. At the same time, the needs have also increased, and so there is always this imbalance that you have. What has happened, and I'm not sure how much donor countries, the traditional ones, are going to increase what is finite for them. So it's clear that you need to find other donors as well. I mean, we have tried a lot with the private sector. I mean, we have I know some of the other sister agencies in the UN, especially UNICEF, but others as well, have a long tradition of engaging through private sector partnership and resource mobilization with the private sector or with the people at large, almost. We have done this much later, but we have certainly started doing that as well. But, we also need, and in a way the Global Compact on Refugees refugee affairs are a concern for everyone, for each and every state, even for the states that are currently not in any way touched well, there's hardly any state, but I mean, they are not touched in the same way. So they need to do something about it. And that realization in the process, in and of itself, has been very important. So we hope that that pool of funding on the humanitarian side will increase and be able to respond to the needs. What we have seen, though, is an increase on the development side. I mean, the fact that, for instance, the World Bank, through one of its international development assistance financial instrument, created last year a refugee sub-window. It's IDA 18. It's called IDA 18 refugee sub-window with 2 billion that they would provide for particularly affected, least developed countries if they are confronted with a refugee influx. That's remarkable. We did not have that before. And this is, again, this is not money, it's not about fundraising for UNHCR. These funds do not come to us, but they come to countries that are affected, and that's what we have an interest in, of course, and that's fantastic because we did not have that before. So we hope that through the GC, through the Global Compact on Refugees, the adaptation of some of these financial instruments take into account the displacement factor, which quite frankly was seen almost as something else, parallel systems, but not necessarily as part of how development planning is done. There's a huge change in that respect. Of course, countries in the global south fear that it could, and that's we have to be very careful about this, that it could deviate development funding for citizens. So it's very clear, and the Global Compact says it's about additional development cooperation as a result of the impact of forced displacement. There's a good study that was done by the World Bank a couple of years ago on the impact of forced displacement on host countries and what this means and what it should produce. So I think there is, at least from our view, really some change that we see and that is tangible and works. Libya, it's a very, as you know, it's an extremely difficult situation. And I think from the perspective of what we're doing inside Libya, it's quite frankly a constant struggle of trying to get people out of detention in these very terrible conditions that they're in. We managed, and that's good, we managed last year to get Niger to establish an emergency transit facility in Niger, and we managed to evacuate about 2,000 people over the last year or so, even a bit less, to get them out of these detention centers and to have a resettlement program run out of Niger into different countries. And I think that's an ongoing struggle. We hope that there will be other countries that will follow this, but we also had direct resettlement into Italy, for example, which was good. So we could get people out of detention. We managed to provide whatever necessary needs they needed, that they would respond to, and we managed to get them out both into Italy but also into Niger. Of course, it's very tough, this situation, because the security situation changes all the time. I mean, there's a very difficult political situation, as you know. We also don't necessarily have the ability to engage with a government that has full control. I mean, and that makes it very difficult to engage on our issues. But I think there has been much more realization that by everyone that indeed this population of both refugees and migrants, they are all in a horrible situation, and we must find ways and means to engage. And we have a close collaboration actually with IOM on this, because IOM, especially when it comes to the return of those who are not refugees and who want to return, they run a program and they have managed to get people back. And of course, we hope that they will also be reintegrated. For the others, we need to make sure that they find another country that is not obviously Libya. But it's a constant struggle in this particular environment. On mental health, actually, I think we still have a lot to do on mental health. I mean, I know from our field colleagues, especially, I mean, I remember those who work with Syrian refugees, who work with inside Iraq, the mental health, I mean, I'm sure it's in most operations around the world, mental health is more recognized, that you need different ways of approaching it, stronger community and healing approaches, community-based healing approaches, but it is still not where it should be. And I think I think we need to make the case again and again and again, because I fully agree with you. Some of the long-term consequences are not necessarily factored in, and the almost generational issues that it passes it on is huge and very, very important. So I think, it would be good to find ways and means to get more mental health programming, especially in these very dramatic and traumatizing situations for the populations. When do we think we have done our job? I don't know how to answer this, to be honest. We hope, we have a campaign with how to end statelessness. We have this I Belong campaign, which is really to getting ourselves out of a job, because we hope that by 2024, we would not have stateless people in the world anymore. I know this is probably extremely difficult to achieve, but we want to keep the aspiration very much alive. And we will have a big event next year to mark the mid-term point on this campaign. On refugees, well, I think, when world peace sets in, then I guess we are out of a job. But I think until then, it's going to be very difficult. Returns of Burundians. I mean, we are engaged in a program from the camps. And, I remember I went to Tanzania last year. We had a dialogue with the government, with the Tanzanian government, so-called protection dialogue. And the issue of returns came up. Because, yes, there is a situation inside Burundi that is, of course, very, very complex and very difficult. And when I was confronted at the time with the request that indeed there are people, the government was saying, look, there are people who really want to go back. So our colleagues did a very in-depth analysis. They sat down with people, they did focus group discussions and all of this. And indeed, as always, refugee populations are not homogeneous. You don't have you also have different groups of people who left the country, who left Burundi at different times. And there was indeed a population, especially farmers from certain provinces in Burundi, who told us they want to go back. They want to go back especially to farm. And it is then our obligation as UNHCR to ensure that we can find ways and means to support them in this. But obviously, absolutely based on the principle of it being free, informed choice of the individuals and on the voluntary basis, but also making sure that we are able to assist them on the Burundian side. And I was in Duta camp in August, and I have to say, we always want to make sure that we do what we can. I can see that we had put in place all the safeguards and the standard operating procedures, working with the government to ensure that indeed this voluntary, we are not in the logic of promotion of returns, but we want to support those who elect to return. And I'm satisfied that indeed our colleagues are doing in guaranteeing this in their engagement with the population. We have, and that's on record, when it comes to the refoulement of Nigerian refugees in the Far East, in the far north of Cameroon, we have made it absolutely clear that any of these forced returns are at variance with international law. I went twice to Cameroon just for that purpose, sitting down with the government, ensuring that we have a discussion about this and finding ways and means to engage with them so that we can ensure that these returns don't occur. It is unfortunate that we have seen, there was a time when we have seen quite high numbers of forced returns of Nigerians back into Nigeria. We have seen less of it, but we still have some of these instances. And we keep raising it, and quite frankly, we keep raising it both with the government, but also publicly. So we are very clear about this. When it comes to the situation of Anglophones, as you can imagine, for us, because this is the country of origin, so we as UNHCR, we are not the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we're the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We are not in a position to deal with the situation inside a country. That is for other parts of the UN to deal with. Oh, yes, voluntary. No, there was the voluntary,
US,
the
yeah.
international lawmaking, and then the US. So, on voluntary and non, I mean, you see, and I'm a lawyer, as you can imagine, I think we need to look at law differently in the future than we did in the past. We know that international lawmaking has been done traditionally through treaties. We have seen a huge especially in the 60s, in the 70s, even in the 80s, we have seen this tradition of making, of crafting, especially multilateral international treaties. I think today it's about the outcome. And if whatever text that is negotiated with states or crafted by states or negotiated between institutions and states has an outcome that delivers it, I don't care whether someone says it's voluntary, involuntary, binding, non-binding, if it has the outcome that we seek to achieve, if you see what I mean. So I think we need to look, I don't want to go into international legal theory, but we need to look at it from an impact perspective, because you actually have, as I was reminded yesterday, even in New York, I understand that the rules of the road are not necessarily always respected. So does this make it less of a law? I guess not. But does it, even if it's not binding, if it's purely voluntary, it often, because it's the right thing to do, it creates precisely what it is meant to achieve. And I think we have seen this certainly with the Global Compact, because the Global Compact, it is the absolutely right thing to do, to get countries, to support countries that are affected. And we have seen, as I was mentioning, even before we see the text adopted, we have already seen the momentum that it has created. On the US, the US is our biggest donor. I mean, we have from the US, it's the main donor that we have, and I think there is support for the programs that UNHCR has, apart from, of course, many other countries. And I think it is also important to say that. Of course, when it comes to issues within the domestic context, it's clear, for instance, when it is issues of asylum, that we continue to have, obviously, discussions with the administration about that. Which we had with all the administrations. And it is important for us to do that, including on issues of access to asylum, of asylum practices. And we have a long tradition of working with them. And nothing is uniform and homogeneous. I mean, we also, let's not forget, we have a very strong tradition of engagement with civil society, with the courts, with the court system, with the administration. And for us, that is our job. That is what protection means. It means engagement, engagement, engagement.
Great, thank you so much. I promised you that we'd be done by 2:30, so I think we'll have to leave it there. I just to say this topic is so often met with such fear and despair and spoken about with much more heat than light, but you've managed to speak with such clarity and specificity that what I take away with this is really the positive developments, that in this moment of tremendous challenge, that there actually are opportunities to enhance our shared responsibility, particularly through the Global Compact. And so we will be watching as the omnibus resolution moves forward, and hopefully you'll come back again to brief us further on the process. And really, many, many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.